Well, it's that time again. And believe it or not, it's show 17 with Dan Raphael and myself answering your questions this week. Dan, how are you?
I'm good, Gareth. How about yourself?
I'm good, but I've been tossing and turning and just running over in my head how the report goes on who wins between the whale and the giant squid.
Last week, we had the discussion on what would happen in this epic showdown.
Yeah.
Refresh the memory of our viewers. Number one, this is a book that my son has been reading during his summer reading program for third grade level reading, although my son is only going into second grade. He reads it very well. And predicted that it would be the squid that would take the victory. I said it would be the whale, and I did that without having read the end, but I will just read to you.
Doesn't the squid take him down into the trenches, into the deep waters? And
some excellent pictures and some artwork there.
Nice.
I'll tell you what happened. I'm going to skip right to the end, so we don't have to go through the whole boring thing. Whale maneuvers and bites a chunk of the squid and a few of the squid's arms. A few more bites and the giant squid is in deep trouble. The whale thinks the giant squid is delicious. Now listen up close, Gareth. The whale wins, but he has sucker and scratch marks all over his head. That fight hurt. But in the end, the whale beats the squid, as I predicted.
So Holyfield beat Tyson. That Holyfield the whale beat Tyson the squid, who got parts of him bitten off and chopped. Well, they both had parts of them bitten off.
So yes, that's been the epic battle of the summer in my household.
Well, it's funny then. Well, look, we on that note then.
Can't say we don't bring our viewers a little bit of entertainment, right?
Well, exactly. And as Learn Guitar Fool, I think it is, says, squid takes the whale into deep water and wins by late stoppage. Then WBC make him franchise champion, so no sharks can ever challenge for the title.
Well said.
Well, you won this one.
If this was my old website chat, I would say pay the man, Shirley.
Pay the man, Shirley. Pay the man. Exactly. I love that. Yeah. And given that you've just beaten me, well, you predicted correctly rather than beaten me. This is from James Clark. Who wins between Gareth and Dan in 1, a 3-rounder, and 2, a 12-rounder? Dan, over to you.
Well, you like to kick. You're throwing those kung fu kicks. So if we're in like an MMA fight, I probably got to give it to you. But in no legs allowed, I'm going to say I'm going to win the fight. But I would never fight you because you're my boy.
Exactly. And I would say that was my answer as well. You couldn't pay me enough money to hit Dan Raphael.
Now,
actually, let me just rephrase that. If they wanted to put it on YouTube and we could both make a few million out of it,
then we would do it.
Then we just sound like those boxers that have really kind of like hit the money stakes. No, you couldn't pay me enough to slap you.
Hey, we could get Eddie Hearn to put us on DAZN as one of their YouTube fights.
Annoyingly, Dan, if you suggested that to him, he might go, that might make a bit of money. So let's not, yeah?
Okay.
I don't know if you know this. I wrote a column about it in the Telegraph, but I did challenge the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to a cage fight about 7 or 8 years ago when he was the mayor of London. And he said he was really annoying me at a drinks party. He was writing for the Telegraph at the time, obviously, who I write for as well. We were at a drinks party. He was being his bumptious self. And I said to him, me and you, cage fight, yeah? And he said, yes, when do we do it? I'm happy to do it. I fight at 217 pounds, fisticuffs. And I spoke to his secretary at the time, a guy called Guta Harry, who was a political journalist, had been a political journalist with the BBC. And we talked about it a little bit. But the more I thought about it, the more I was thinking...
Not good.
Do I want to be remembered as the guy that needs the future British Prime Minister in the face? Imagine just being remembered for that,
Listen, I mean...
Right now...
Your country might be better off had you fought him and kneed him in the face and he never got elected Prime Minister.
Anyway, this is a really good one. And Untouchable, who's a regular friend of the show. Thank you very much. And thanks for all your questions on Untouchable. Thanks, guys. Top show as always. I have 2 questions. Fantasy matchup. Prime Joe Calzaghe versus Prime Andre Ward. Who wins and why? His answer is, both have high ring IQ, but I think Calzaghe would be far too busy for Ward.
You want me to take that first?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I've heard that's been a fantasy fight that has been suggested to me over the years. And, you know, I have nothing but respect for both fighters. They both did it the right way. They both, you know, when the opportunities came to them, they fought those fights that they needed to fight. And they both retired undefeated. They're both, you know, Calzaghe and Ward will be side by side in the Hall of Fame together when Ward, you know, should be on the ballot in the next election. But head to head, you know, no disrespect to Calzaghe whatsoever. But I always just thought that he was always slightly vulnerable in some fights, even though he won, and that Ward really wasn't. And Ward, I thought, you know, didn't have problems with southpaws. You know, his defense was supreme. He could fight going backward. He could fight coming forward. He could stand in the pocket and mixed up if necessary, but he could also be defensive if necessary and move around the ring. I just felt like Ward could just do a little bit more overall, you know, in a whole variety of styles that would be enough to defeat Calzaghe by decision in a competitive fight. But I would give the nod to Andre Ward.
The truth is with Andre Ward, and I've discussed this on my radio show in the UK before, and I feel it takes 2 fights to settle it between them almost. But the great thing about Andre Ward, tell me his style. He doesn't have one. He was able to mirror the other fighters and adapt. And because he was so versatile and so relaxed and so complete as a fighter, he was very difficult to prepare for other fighters. I think Calzaghe would have been ahead in the fight, maybe even to the 7th round, but I think Ward would have ended up drawing it, and I've got a split draw for the first fight.
Well, like I said, I thought that Ward would figure out a way to win, you know, a competitive decision. But I mean, the point is, I think we both agree that it would be an evenly matched up kind of bout that would have been, you know, if you're a gambler, would have had great action on both camps, because a lot of people would be picking one side or the other. It's a great historical matchup, and you know, they just sort of missed each other. You know, it wasn't, if Joe had stuck around for a couple of more years, it was the kind of match that wasn't out of the realm of possibility. Perhaps Joe wouldn't have still been in his prime, but you know, they just barely missed each other. And then Ward got his big win at that time. It came against Froch instead of against Calzaghe.
This is a really good question. I don't have an answer for this right away. I may need to think about it and Untouchable and give you an answer on the next show. Dan may have one on the top of his head, but which fight in boxing history would you consider as a good example of a perfect performance? Apart from a 1-round KO, for me, it has to be Muhammad Ali, that is, versus Cleveland Williams. I do know that fight, and he was amazing. And Untouchable says, simply beautiful to watch from time to time.
Well, I mean, you know, look, I'm going to think about fights that I covered. You know, if you're going to go back through history, I mean, there's millions of fights that you could talk about. But when you, and I'm saying this because it's what first popped into my head. It doesn't mean it's the only answer or it's the right answer. But you said, what was the question? The most perfect performance? When you said that and you mentioned about no knockout, or, you know, not a first round knockout, 2 things came to my mind. First one that came to my mind was Felix Trinidad against Winky Wright, when Winky Wright just absolutely annihilated him by standing right in front of him and jabbing him for 12 rounds, and, you know, moving from, he didn't run, he didn't play defense, he stood in the pocket and he just annihilated Felix Trinidad. He boxed, yeah. So and then the other one that I think about is, because it was the perfect game plan, and he did exactly what he was there to do. And he did it perfectly in a big spot and won handily, the way a lot of people sort of thought he would, but weren't sure he would. And that was when Roy Jones went up to the heavyweight division and beat up on John Ruiz.
Yeah, that's true.
Again, it wasn't the
lumbering John Ruiz.
Fair enough. But the point was, from Roy's perspective, the whole point was to win that belt. And he could do so by employing a perfect kind of performance in that fight against an opponent that they selected. They drew up their game plan for. He stuck to that, and he did it flawlessly. And so to me, it's those two fights. It's Trinidad against Winky, Winky rather beating Trinidad, and Roy Jones doing what he did to Ruiz. Now, those are just two examples. I could come up with others, but off top of
well, two have come up on top of my head while you've been talking. One was David Haye against Nikolai Valuev. Perfect game plan. David Haye was output. It was a very technical fight from David Haye. He completely outboxed the giant. I almost remember him running through the guy's legs at one point. He didn't, but it was a little bit like that. And the man we mentioned just now, Joe Calzaghe against Jeff Lacey.
Also, yeah.
It was pitch perfect. There are so many, aren't there, Dan? We'll move on because there are so many fights. And amazingly, just one little footnote on that Calzaghe performance. Of course, he had a damaged hand, and his father and Frank Warren really had to persuade him to fight that night because he wanted to pull out.
I didn't know that.
Keep these coming. These are great, guys, says XTC. We might have done this. How was the pizza, Gareth? Do you know what? I didn't have pizza in the end. Yeah? I had fish and chips.
Okay.
Tell Dan what he thinks of our pizza is what we think of the spray-on cheese they have in America. Paul from Tunbridge Wells, which is in Kent here in England, says, thanks, Dan and Gareth. I love these videos you guys do. I really hope that after lockdown you manage to carry these videos on in some capacity. We will, Paul, won't we, Dan?
I hope so, sure.
Watch every show, you guys. Love, love, love it. And he had curry that night. He's telling.
Is that a question or is that just?
It's just a statement. But
okay.
Then we've got Mark Miller sent us a little link for dating girls online. We're not interested right now, Mark.
No, I'm a happily married man.
Exactly. I'm happily single. Right. So
you brought a couple of girls around when we've had dinner together in Vegas with some of the boys. You always have a girl on your arm. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah, well, one has to. It goes with the shirt, the glasses, the flow. Jack Gallagher. I'm sorry to hark back to the JM words, Gerald Miller. Jack Gallagher says, I'd like to see if Miller would take a lie detector test. Dan, I don't think we need one.
Yeah, because here's the bottom line: lie detector test. Maybe it would give some people a thought about, if he's telling the truth or not, if he took them. But the reality is, under the rules, you're responsible for what's in your body. So even if he didn't do it on purpose, you still got to be a dummy to be taking stuff that you're not aware of what's in it. So I don't think a lie detector test means anything. He's been caught numerous times. This is not like one time for a trace amount of a drug that's, in the scheme of the drugs, not considered that big of a deal. He was caught several times with hardcore stuff, leading up to bouts that were on the calendar. So I don't need a lie detector test.
These are a few questions here. There's 4 questions here from Daniel Moore that we'll deal with. Thanks for these, Daniel. This is a good one for you, Dan. Is 2020 going to bring us any closer to the Undisputed title at 68? Obviously, he means 168 pounds or 12 stone, as we say here in the UK. If so, who do we think has the best shot of being that number one?
I don't know if we're going to get to the Undisputed in that weight class because the titles are fractured at the moment. You've got. I'm trying to think who the champions are. You've got Caleb Plant, who's
Callum Smith.
Callum Smith, of course.
Billy Joe Saunders, and who's the 4th one? I guess Canelo. Ramirez.
Canelo has a tier title in the WBA. But anyway, because there's so much fracturing, in the division, it's not like it would just take one fight for there to become an undisputed champion. Like in the heavyweight division, if we can ever get to Joshua and Fury, the winner's the undisputed champion as long as the organizations allow them to keep the belts. In the 168-pound weight division, you're nowhere near that. There's no movement for a tournament. The guys fight on different platforms in terms of their broadcasters. I don't know if the guys would necessarily turn down those fights if offered if there was enough money, but I don't see there being not only not an undisputed champion or even a strong pathway towards that. I'm not even sure we get an authentic unification fight. And I say that because you tell me, do you see Eddie making a run to try to make Callum Smith against Billy Joe Saunders? I don't see that happening. Caleb, off doing his thing, you know.
Just to clarify, because I just looked them up. David Benavides is the WBC. Callum Smith.
Okay, that's a good point. The one fight that might happen, with a lowercase m, might be Plant against Benavides.
Yes, yeah.
Both in the PBC, but even still, when that's been discussed, they've sort of called each other out a little bit. That's probably at the earliest you're talking about next year. You know, I don't think guys are going to come back in the fall and go right into that fight. I don't think that's happening. Benavides had a fight that was postponed in the earlier part of the pandemic, and I'm assuming that when he gets back in the ring, they'll reschedule that particular fight. So to make a long story short, no is the answer to that question.
For me, though, Alvarez beats all of them at 168 anyway, in my view.
But we're not. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I don't necessarily see that those fights happen. That said, I would give, because of the youth and the hardcore rage in the way he fights, I would definitely give Benavides a chance to make things extremely uncomfortable for Canelo Alvarez.
Has Bud Crawford ever fought a genuine 50-50? Has Loma? That's Vasyl Lomachenko, obviously. And if not, is this because they've avoided the best opposition, or because that opposition doesn't exist? Good question.
I mean, as far as Lomachenko goes, I would say no. He's been, off the top of my head, he's been a pretty hefty favorite in every one of his fights, even though he's fought a lot of very quality opposition throughout his very brief professional career of only about 15 fights. But he has, you know, moved up from 126 to 130 to 135, you know, seeking out the biggest names. I guess if you look back, the one fight where there was actually, I can't remember what the actual odds were, but there was definitely a faction that were saying Loma was going to win, and definitely a faction that were saying that his opponent would win. And that was when Lomachenko was, I believe he was 1-1, and he fought Gary Russell Jr. for the WBC featherweight title at a time when Gary Russell at that point was probably like about 23-0 or something like that. And Lomachenko, you know, just beat him easily. I'd say that was probably the only time he was in a fight that was deemed somewhat 50-50 by the fans and the public and the media. As far as, and it's not because he's not looking to fight the bigger names. I mean, he went up and fought Linares. He took on all comers and guys with titles. As far as Crawford, you know, I don't think that Crawford is ducking or dodging anybody. He'll fight whoever. He's wanted Pacquiao for a while. He wants to fight, you know, the Errol Spences and the, you know, Danny Garcias, Keith Thurman. You know, the problem has always been that they are on the opposite sides of the street, as the vernacular goes, and those are hard, complicated fights to make. You know, he hasn't been at welterweight for that long, and so it's only become in like the last, let's say, year that the movement's really been to try to make, you know, or that we want to see that big fight with Spence. As a lightweight and as a junior welterweight, you know, he cleaned up the junior welterweight division. He became undisputed, so it wasn't like he ducked or dodged anybody. And in the lightweight division, he couldn't land the big matchups either. So, but he went on the road to win the title. He didn't have a problem going to the UK to win his championship the first time around. So I think it's a matter of not anybody trying to avoid anybody. It's just, you know, got to get the business right, and you have to have political will on both sides to make those big fights. They're fantastic fighters. I think right behind Canelo Alvarez, in whatever order you want to put them, I've got Crawford and Loma, you know, 2 and 3, or, you know, 1A, 1B, 1C, whatever, and on the pound for pound list. They're both tremendous boxers.
Look at just let me just add to what you've just said. Okay, Gary Russell Jr. was 24-0 when Loma beat him in his third fight.
Yeah, he was 1-1.
Nicholas Walters was 26-1.
Made him quit.
Guillermo Rigondeaux was 17-0. Jorge Linares was
moving up in weight, but the great Olympian, and again, didn't just beat him.
He made him quit.
He went through a series. I believe that Loma had 4 fights in a row where he made the opponent quit.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. That Rigondeaux, Jorge Linares, Jose Pedraza, Luke Campbell, as we've talked about on previous shows as well. We know how good he is. The key for me, Dan, in this question is that we will see it this year. These two have absolute greatness within them. I'm talking about Terence Crawford and Vasyl Lomachenko. Teofimo Lopez will be an amazing challenge for him. Stylistically, it'll be the bull and the matador. with the matador being Vasyl Lomachenko, because Teofimo is one of the greatest young bull studs we've got out there in the game. He totally believes in himself. He totally believes he's going to smash Lomachenko to bits. And it's going to be a tremendous occasion and a tremendous spectacle. Ditto, when this fight happens in the next 12 months, and I think it will, Terence Crawford and Errol Spence. Now, if Terence Crawford and Vasyl Lomachenko both walk away from victories in those two fights, they start to belong with the greats, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, but again, we just want to see both of those guys have the chance to have the biggest fights that are available.
With zero title defense, we're still on our friend Daniel Moore's questions. With zero title defenses in 2 reigns, is Tyson Fury really the number 1 at heavyweight? Or despite the KO defeat, is Joshua the king? That we're talking heavies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't accept the characterization of the question, because if you are like myself and you put a lot of stock in the lineal championship, when he beat Klitschko, Fury was the lineal champion, and every single fight since then has been a defense of the lineal title. Even when he was fighting, the comeback fights, if you lose and you're at heavyweight where there's no weight limit and you lose, you lost to the lineal title because the other guy becomes the man who beat the man. So no, that's nonsense. Tyson Fury is the heavyweight champion of the world. He's made multiple title defenses of the lineal title. He just recently added the WBC title to that collection. And he has proven himself to be the number 1 heavyweight by virtue of destroying Deontay Wilder in the fight that was this past February. So
I completely agree.
That's a pretty basic answer. Honestly, I don't even think there would be a lot of disagreement with that kind of answer.
Well, I mean, and it's not because he calls me Russell Crowe or anything like that, or I'm close with him. I completely agree with you. The thing is with Fury, he is an enigma for every other heavyweight. He's a puzzle to solve. Even Bernd Bunte, who's a friend of both of ours, I read an interview with him today where he said he doesn't respect some of the things that Fury does or says or has done or has said. But he said, you've got to respect how difficult he is as an opponent. And
he's willing to fight guys. I mean, look, he fought Wilder coming off 2 lower level fights after a long layoff and a lot of problems. And, maybe he didn't get his hand raised, but a lot of people thought he won. At worst, he got the draw. And he came back and fought him right away in the rematch and, beat him up pretty good. He defeated Klitschko. So, I mean, in his time, again, he still has a ways to go in my mind before you can anoint him as one of the all-time greats. But he's off to a decent start with in the minds of many, 2 wins over Wilder, including a devastating knockout, and a decision over Klitschko in a fight where I didn't think that either one of them fought particularly well, but certainly Tyson Fury deserved to be the winner, and he beat the guy that had been the heavyweight champion for like a decade. I'm not sure what else would he have to do besides knock out Wilder the way he did to be considered number 1 at this moment in time? Because I don't think you can consider Joshua number 1 at the moment. Nothing against Joshua. I'm a huge fan, but he did lose recently to a massive underdog in Ruiz. So that would knock him off the number 1 spot. The only other guy that's even in the conversation is Wilder, and Wilder just got knocked out by Fury. So just by that basic sort of comparison of their recent fights, I mean, nobody argues that Fury's not the number 1 fighter in the world. I think, even other heavyweights would give it up to him at this moment in time. Tyson Fury is the heavyweight champ and number 1. They're not always the same guy, usually, but the guy that's the champ and the guy that's number 1 sometimes are different. In this case, it's very clear they're the same.
Alfie Dunn says, great show again, guys. Who would you say are the best 3 contenders at heavyweight besides the champions and Wilder?
The best 3 at heavyweight besides the champions and Wilder? Well, I mean, you got to still put Wilder. You got to probably put Dillian White up there for sure. He's got a very good resume and a good body of work at the moment. I don't know. Who do you think is after those? I mean, my top.
I think Joseph Parker belongs in that list.
Joseph Parker is definitely worthwhile for sure. He's won some solid fights since the loss to Joshua.
Mm-hmm. And I think Daniel Dubois is a contender, although he's still very young.
Yeah, I wouldn't put him up that high just yet. Only not because he's talented, but just because he has no wins of real consequence. Just
Alexander Usyk, Derek Chisora. I mean, but Usyk. I'd say Usyk, Parker, White.
I would put White ahead of those two guys. Usyk, I like the potential. He's only had the one fight as a heavyweight against a real true second-tier type opponent in Chaz Witherspoon. I need to see a little bit more out of him. Povetkin is still hanging around. If he can beat Dillian White, that would obviously put him back in a good position. Robert Helenius has rejuvenated his career with a win over Konaki, back in March. I'm not saying that puts him in the top 4, but it at least puts him in position to have another fight of consequence. But right now, the heavyweight division has interesting fighters scattered throughout the top 10. But what makes it really interesting is because it's very top heavy. And when I say that, I'm talking about Fury, Wilder, and Joshua, and then just a half step behind them with Dillian White. So you got 4 very interesting guys right at the top, and then a whole bunch of other guys that are rounding out. Not to mention, good up and comers that we've talked about, like a Dubois, Joe Joyce, Hrgovic, young fighters like I shouldn't say young because Joe is a little older, but guys with a lot of professional experience so far in their careers.
I'm going to get a couple of questions here off Twitter, and then I'm going to go to some questions that have come in about Jorge Masvidal, the UFC fighter that we spoke about on the last show, Dan. Right, here we go. This is a good one. It's from Oscar Berumen, who looks a little bit like Mike Coppinger, and he's sitting at his dinner table having dinner, believe it or not, on his Twitter photo. Nothing wrong with that. And if I could get a little bit closer, I could tell you what he's having for dinner. No, I can't make it any larger.
I just want to hear the question. I don't give a shit what he's having for dinner.
What are you having for dinner?
I don't know.
Yeah, come on, it's getting close to dinner time now.
No, it's not. It's still the afternoon. It's only
you're getting stuff from the fresh
vegetables. It's only 20 after 3 here in the United States, my time. So we're still.
All right. What did you have for lunch?
For lunch, I had a grilled cheese sandwich actually. With a little
did you have that stringy, horrible cheese that you have in America?
No, a nice piece of fresh. Had some nice yellow pepper, like fresh yellow pepper slices cut up, and a couple of carrots, little mini carrots. It was good little lunch.
Did you make the lunch, or did your wife make the lunch?
No, my wife made lunch for both of us.
That's very nice of her.
Son was outside riding his bike around.
Keep her sweet, Dan. You know that.
Yes, sir.
Canelo versus whom on September the 12th? And will it be in Vegas?
Well, number one, I'm not entirely convinced that there will be a Canelo fight in September. I mean, I hope so. So that's, everything about the schedule right now is up in the air because it depends on what's happening with the virus. I guess it would probably be in Vegas where they've come up with protocols to handle these types of fights. I'm not sure where else they would do it. And who he'll fight. I mean, there's been a number of names that have been out there in discussion. I mean, originally, if the fight had been in May, he was supposed to fight Billy Joe Saunders, but that's not happening now for a variety of reasons. So, it comes down to, at the moment, there are a couple of guys that have at least been in contact with them. One of them is Sergey Derenchenko, which was the opponent that he could have potentially faced, a while back, and he ended up, doing a different fight. Maybe there'll be some conversation once again. They'll bring the conversation back to a Callum Smith, who was also in the running before it seemed that Billy Joe was going to get the fight before everything blew up. So, I guess if I had I guess it could be Callum. It could be Derenchenko. In a situation like with Callum Smith, obviously part of it's going to be dependent upon what the travel restrictions are between the United States and the UK. Derenchenko is not from the United States, but he lives in New York, so it's not an issue as far as the travel goes. But it seems like it'll be somebody like that, but your guess is as good as mine. I don't think that there's a definitive answer just yet. I don't think there's a definitive answer about whether Canelo, he has said apparently that he would take into consideration the prospect of fighting with no crowd, but that's all well and good. But until you put a piece of paper and a contract in front of him and lay out the terms and how much of a pay cut he's going to have to take and all that, everything is up in the air.
Well, I think it's so indefinitive at the moment that I'm not even going to give an answer to it because we really don't know, and that's just the truth. And I spoke to Eddie Hearn about this a few hours ago as well, and I don't think it's going to be Callum Smith either. I'm really not sure at all, and it wouldn't surprise me if it went later than September. Although DAZN have just announced they're going global, so there will be a fight of some kind. Question here. I like this one. Do you think Gareth's checkered Vans, I'm wearing plain ones at the moment, unfortunately, would go nicely with your fleece, Dan.
I think everything goes well with the fleece. So yes.
Okay.
Should I wear the fleece for one of the shows? Should I go get it?
Well, I want it on the next show, definitely.
Okay.
I'll
take that under advisement.
So this Jorge Masvidal question, and this obviously is going out just before the UFC event tonight in Abu Dhabi and Yas Island. The UFC are calling it Fight Island, of course. They've got several events there over a few weeks. Papa Dog told us from our last show that Masvidal did an interview and said that he only had one bite of that pizza, by the way, his teammate the rest. Matt McGonigal, friend of mine at the Telegraph, says, tell Masvidal my nan wants her dressing gown back. Taking the fight, Manny Robles, who I think we know, Manny_boxing, Manny Robles.
I love when you roll your R's, Gareth.
Robles. And do you know what? I love Manny Robles as well. Taking the fight on 6 days' notice is amazing. When traveling to a different time zone, you would generally need at least 2 weeks to adjust to that. If Masvidal wins, it's great on so many levels. Hashtag new fan, says Manny. I think that's a good call, Dan, you know?
Yeah, well, listen, if that's the Manny Robles, that's the trainer that we know and love, his guy, Andy Ruiz, took the fight with Joshua. It wasn't 6 days notice, but it was like 3 weeks notice. And he ended up winning that fight. As far as the time zone thing goes, I've talked to different fighters who've dealt with that situation in their careers. And there's sort of different schools of thought. Some guys like to do it the way that Manny suggested, which is you need a couple of weeks, especially if you're going that distance and that many time zones. That you'd like to be there, a good bit of time ahead of time, whether it's 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever. But then there's others who sometimes, depending on what the promotional, how much you have to do in the promotional end of things, they're okay with getting there closer to the fight and just trying to stay on, whatever time that they're going to be fighting, and just carry on the way that they normally would. So, for example, when Manny Pacquiao fought in Australia against Jeff Horn, and a lot of the people went there from the United States, they basically now granted that fight took place in the early morning hours in Australia because it was meant for the United States in our prime time in the evening. So what a lot of people did was they just treated everything in the promotion as if it was taking place in United States Coast, East Coast United States time. So the press conference took place at whatever time it was in Australia, but in their minds and on their bodies, it was still taking place, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And they just basically stayed on that time as much as possible while they were there. It may be a little more complicated for a fighter because they do have, if the fight is taking place at the normal local time. But I'm not sure. With this UFC event, even though they're in Abu Dhabi, I believe it's still, the timing of it is still to accommodate the United States prime, which is where the bulk of the pay-per-view comes from. So I would think that all the people associated with it, the boxer, or the fighters and the trainers and the promotional people and everybody involved would do their best to try to stay on United States East Coast time, whatever time it is in Abu Dhabi. So that should make it a little bit easier for a fighter that's traveling to just stay on whatever time. And you're not worried if it's midnight in Abu Dhabi, just because it's dark out, who cares? You want to stay your body on the time that you're going to fight, which would be United States East Coast time. So, I think that is something that they'll be able to do because the time of the fight is geared towards here, not there.
No, that's what they're doing. I mean, even the journalists, I think, are trying to stay up as late at night as they can to start the day, to sleep through the day. I mean, I remember when Manny Pacquiao was fighting in Macau, Dan. I think you were at those fights as well.
I did not attend those fights, but I covered them from afar. But you still did them as though you were, it was a normal. I watched the press conference, and if it was at the afternoon, it was the afternoon, even though it was the early morning in the Macau facility.
Exactly. We were doing it. I think for you, it would have been, we were 13 hours ahead of you, basically. Something like that.
Pretty much. I mean, it's like basically Macau to U.S. East Coast is like, if it's midnight here, it's approximately noontime there. It's like, I think it was between 12 and 14 hours difference.
Final question today, Dan, and it's kind of a statement about Doug Digsy. who says on Twitter here, boxers could do it, Gareth. However, it wouldn't be as competitive. And he's talking about Masvidal taking it on 6 days' notice. The UFC as a brand has created a culture of the best fighting the best. Not always, but that is the ethos. Yes, it is. That's the more that they use. Boxing is too fractious with too many organizations. It's less sport orientated and more political. Well, that's not strictly true. Haribo West says that's spot on, but it's a moving chicane, isn't it, Dan? In some divisions, look what we got with Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, for example. We got that heavyweight fight very quickly. It often depends situationally, and he's not right. He's not wrong. It is largely political. And you said it earlier. You can take more of a risk. It's like the old game, snakes and ladders. You lose in MMA and you slide down the snake, and then you quickly rise up the ladder. If you're a top 20 contender and you have 4 wins on the trot, you've got a very good chance of getting the title. And it's as simple as that.
Well, I mean, part of the reason is the UFC makes their own rankings. You know, they get to decide who they want to fight for the title. I mean, I suppose they take into account, what the would be, or, who actually deserves it, but they can do what they want to do. There's one organization and they're it. In boxing, there are many masters to handle. You have the various sanctioning bodies, the television broadcasters who are separated. You have the promotional entities which are separated. You
have the lawyers, the managers, the wives, the husbands. The thing, there's a bit.
I'm not here to knock anything to do with UFC or MMA. I have respect for what those guys have done. Dana White, I've told you that before. He's brilliant at what he does. But, and this is just being real, it's easier in UFC because they're essentially a monopoly. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's easier than in boxing, because in UFC, if you have all the guys under contract, or 95% of the ones who mean anything, eventually you can make those matchups, because where else are they going?
Yeah, exactly.
And on top of that, because they're essentially a monopoly, the pay scale is less, because the company keeps more of the money. The division of the profits between UFC, the company, and the actual athletes is not nearly as generous as.
Well, Dan, this is important. Dan, this has been made very public in the last few weeks with the unhappiness of people like Masvidal, of John Jones, one of their great champions, the only guy to step outside and show that you can make more money, and it's one of the reasons for this, is their wonderkind Conor McGregor, because he made $120 million for fighting Floyd Mayweather.
He had to come to boxing.
Exactly.
Boxing,
boxing guy, where are you? Where are you? I'll find you in the garden.
I want to finish the point, though. In boxing, when you have 7 entities, they are competing. So, Frank, a PBC, an Eddie Hearn, a Golden Boy, some of the promoters that are just underneath those guys, and then you have the entities that are broadcasters that compete with each other, whether it's ESPN or Fox/Showtime with PBC or DAZN. The point is, when the fighters are in demand, you have multiple people bidding on your services, and they'll pay a lot of money for it. When you then sign with that promoter, they command a lot of the power in terms of how they cut up what's available when the revenue pours in from the big event. So in boxing, a lot of times on the biggest events, when it was the big Oscar De La Hoya fight, or the big Pacquiao fight, or a Canelo fight, or what have you, or Mayweather was a little different because he basically controlled his own business to a large degree, but even he had to pay out some of the money. But the split with the fighter promoter, generally speaking, is around 80%, 75% to the fighter, 20, 25% to the promoter. It's almost like the opposite in UFC in how they make money.
No, it is the opposite.
Make the big fights in UFC. In boxing, you can't do that easily because there's so much at stake financially and for all the different folks. If you have one entity, it might be better for the fans, but it'd be worse for the athletes. And that's a fact.
No, it's great that you explained like that. What came to mind, that's why, for anyone watching this, young people like Devin Haney who feel like they have a massive future, that's why he registered himself as a promoter at the age of 20, because he's seeding for the future. He's hoping to reap what he's sowing right now. And it wasn't till Floyd Mayweather and Oscar De La Hoya left Bob Arum's promotional company that they made the genuinely big bucks. The UFC...
Whoa, time out. in Floyd's case, that may be true because he didn't become a star until he was no longer with Top Rank. But Oscar De La Hoya made gazillions of dollars with Top Rank and did many deals with Bob where he was getting 80% or 75% of the money, and the Top Rank side was getting the 20-25%. And I'll tell you a story about that. You know, when Bob and Oscar had their first initial fracture, it came somewhat after the Tito Trinidad first fight, where they had a serious disagreement. And why? Because when that fight was made, Oscar De La Hoya and his people had two choices. And every fighter does this in a big fight. You can either take the big guarantee, or you can take a little bit of a lesser guarantee of your money, but you get a much bigger percentage of what the profits are.
Pay-per-view, yeah.
The upside, where the real money is, on the pay-per-view coming in. And in the Trinidad fight, Oscar had that choice. He decided to take the guarantee. And the pay-per-view went through the roof, and it broke the record for non-heavyweight fight. And he got pissed off because in the end, Bob Arum made more money on that fight than Oscar De La Hoya. He was upset by that. Now, Bob didn't do anything wrong. He had presented him with either choice, take the upside or take the guarantee. Oscar made the selection, or his team made the selection. They took the guarantee. He still made a lot of money. And in subsequent fights, he made crazy money in pay-per-view fights with and without Bob. So, you know, we can find things to criticize Bob Arum about, but that is not one of them.
No, I'm not criticizing Bob. My point was that that the MMA fighter doesn't have that power to be able to do that. That's all. If they leave the UFC, I say that Conor McGregor could probably leave the UFC and make his own setup and fight Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, Paulie Malignaggi, and no, he could probably make He could probably make 400 million. I actually believe, and we're going to end with this, Dan, and I want your answer on it because I'm going to ask you a question. Are we going to see Mayweather McGregor 2? And I'm going to say, yes, we will now because of the pandemic, sometime in the next 14 months.
I'm going to say no. I just, you know, I'm saying that partly because I don't think it's going to happen. I'm saying it partly because I don't want it to happen. But I don't know what the pandemic has to do with it, because one of the things that makes that fight as rich as it could be is the gate. Now, yes, the pay-per-view. I mean, the pay-per-view that it generated when they fought in 2017 was what, 4 million buys. It was you know, a couple 100,000 less than what they did for Mayweather Pacquiao, but it was all-time second place.
How much is 4 million buys?
No, it's a huge amount of money. But don't make a mistake, though. The gate was, you know, tens of millions of dollars also. But the point I was going to make is, do you honestly believe that at this moment in time that pay-per-view on the rematch would do that kind of number? I don't. I mean, sure, there'll be a lot of people that will buy it, but a lot of people will be like, I saw that. I'm not giving it, you know, I'm not giving Conor McGregor a chance in a match. Most people don't give a chance in a boxing match the first.
Look,
gotten better at boxing.
They're master salesmen. They are masters of self-promotion, and they will tweak it. Things will happen. They will tweak the parameters of what can happen in the fight. They will, you know, maybe allow some kind of kicking, or no, I don't want to get all into this, but something will happen.
I got one other thing to say about why the magnitude of the event would be less. When they made that match in 2017, one of the things that, I mean, we knew it was going to be a big fight when it got made, but one of the things that blew it up to the next level, that really kind of put it over the top as far as they could do the crazy pay-per-view that it did, was when they went on that tour and had those televised, basically matches, but got all the fans hyped up in those cities and, you know, filled up arenas just to watch.
Do it again, Dan, but they're doing it a different way. They could do it again.
But they're not going to be able to fill up an arena in this time when there's social distancing.
It might not matter.
You know, I went to the Barclays Center when they did the New York City stop on that press tour. Barclays Center is a big NBA arena, holds 20,000 people or whatever. They had like 20,000 people there.
I did LA. I did LA and Wembley with them, and it was off the charts. It was.
But the point is, they would not be able to replicate that because you wouldn't be able to fill up an arena to do that type of event.
There's ways and means.
I just don't see it happening.
Okay. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
I'm very sad that the whale beat the giant squid, but there's always the rematch.
Well, I'll have to see if there's a sequel to the book.
Because remember, there'll be another giant squid comes along at some point and is bigger, so much bigger than the whale.
We'll start talking shit to the other whale?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But there's no shit talking between us. It's lovely to see you, as always. Great answers. And if you're watching this for me and Dan, keep your questions coming. Keep enjoying. Keep sending us comments, because we love the comments, because it fuels us to do more, doesn't it, Dan?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. No, sir. We'll see you next time, sir. Yeah.
I look forward to it. Take care, buddy.